The Russian Orthodox Church is traditionally said to have been founded by the Apostle Andrew, who is thought to have visited Scythia and Greek colonies along the northern coast of the Black Sea. According to one of the legends, St.Andrew reached the future location of Kiev and foretold the foundation of a great Christian city. The spot where he reportedly erected a cross is now marked by St. Andrew's Cathedral. Christianization of the Rus. The Kievan period. Orthodox Christian Constantinople's greatest mission outreach was to areas known as Kiev and Rus that are now the states of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Christianity was introduced into Kiev and Rus by Greek missionaries from Byzantium in the 9th century. In 863 to 869, St. Cyril and St. Methodius translated parts of the Bible into Old Church Slavonic language for the first time, paving the way for the Christianization of the Slavists. There is evidence that the first Christian bishop was sent to Novgorod from Constantinople, either by Patriarch Photius or Patriarch Ignatius, circa 866–867 AD. By the mid-10th century, there was already a Christian community among Kievan nobility, under the leadership of Greek and Byzantine priests. Although paganism remained the dominant religion, Princess Olga of Kiev was the first ruler of Kiev and Rus to convert to Christianity, either in 945 or 957. Undoubtedly influenced by his Christian head-mother and by a proposed marriage alliance with the Byzantine imperial family. Olga's grandson Vladimir I, Prince of Kiev, from among several options, chose the Byzantine rite. Baptized in 988, he led the Kievans to Christianity. This date is often considered the official birthday of the Russian Orthodox Church. Thus, in 1988, the Church celebrated its millennial anniversary. The Kievan Church was originally a metropolitanate of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, and the Ecumenical Patriarch, along with the Emperor, appointed the Metropolitan who governed the Church of Rus. The Metropolitan's residence was originally located in Kiev. As Kiev was losing its political significance due to the Mongol invasion, Metropolitan Maximus moved to Vladimir in 1299. His successors, Metropolitan Peter and Theognostus, moved the residence to Moscow by the 14th century. Under Mongol rule. While Russia lay under Mongol rule from the 13th through the 15th century, the Russian Church enjoyed a favored position, obtaining immunity from taxation in 1270. This period saw a remarkable growth of monasticism. The monastery of the Caves in Kiev, founded in the mid-11th century by the ascetics St. Anthony and St. Theodosius, was superseded as the foremost religious center by the Monastery of the Holy Trinity, which was founded in the mid-14th century by St. Sergius of Radanez. Sergius, as well as the Metropolitans St. Peter and St. Alexius, supported the rising power of the Principality of Moscow. The Church enjoyed protection for its land and buildings as well as freedom from taxes. In addition, it was guaranteed freedom from persecution in accordance with Islamic religious law. To that extent, there was even a legal relationship between the Golden Horde and the Russian Orthodox Church, since these rights had been conceded in a formal document. The Church was only required to pray for the Khan. This continuation of the symphony corresponded with the Orthodox idea of a state that protected the Orthodox Church and, therefore, could call for loyalty. Centuries later, the ecumenical patriarchs dealt hardly differently with the Ottoman rulers. In 1261, the Russian Church established an eparchy in Surrey, the capital of the Golden Horde. The increasing importance of Moscow and the growing power of the political system also created ideas that contributed to a theological basis of the stature of Moscow. References have already been made regarding the perception notion of Moscow as a third Rome. For the moment the sources began to use more the notion Zarstvo, representing a translation of the Greek Basileia, the metropolitan of Moscow. Macari contributed above all to the strength and emphasis of the Moscow idea of the state. He emphasized the Russian ecclesiastical tradition. He made brief readings available, Menians, which were arranged according to the calendar so that they could be read continuously in the liturgy and in the monasteries. These had strong Russian features and supported a providential view of the Russian political system. 15th century. During the 15th century, the Russian Church was pivotal in the survival and life of the Russian state. Such holy figures as Sergius of Radonez and Metropolitan Alexis helped the country to withstand years of Tatar oppression, and to expand both economically and spiritually. At the Council of Florence 1439, a group of Orthodox Church leaders agreed upon terms of reunification with papacy. The Moscow Prince Vasily II, however, rejected the concessions to the Roman Church and forbade the proclamation of the Acts of the Council in Moscow in 1452. The Russian Metropolitan, Isidore, who had signed the Union Act, was in the same year expelled from his position as an apostate. In 1448, the Russian Church in Moscow became effectively independent from the Patriarchate of Constantinople, when the Russian bishops in Moscow elected their own primate, Jonas, a Russian bishop, without recourse to Constantinople. The Russian Church within the bounds of the Grand Duchy of Moscow was thenceforth effectively autocephalous. Metropolitan Jonas was given the title of Metropolitan of Kiev and Alruz, but his successors styled themselves as Metropolitans of Moscow and Alruz. 5 years later, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. From this point onward, the Russian Orthodox Church saw Moscow as the third Rome, legitimate successor to Constantinople, and the Metropolitan of Moscow as head of the Russian Church. Changes and reforms. The reign of Ivan III and his successor was plagued by numerous heresies and controversies. One party, led by Nilsorsky and Vasienko, called for secularization of monastic properties. They were opposed by the influential Joseph of Volosky, who defended ecclesiastical ownership of land and property. The sovereign's position fluctuated, but eventually he threw his support to Joseph. New sects sprang up, some of which showed a tendency to revert to Mosaic law. For instance, the archpriest Alexei converted to Judaism after meeting a certain Zechariah the Jew. Monastic life flourished in Russia, focusing on prayer and spiritual growth. The disciples of St. Sergius left the Troitsa Sergiyeva Lavra to found hundreds of monasteries across Russia. Some of the most famous monasteries were located in the Russian north. In order to demonstrate how faith could flourish in the most inhospitable lands, the richest landowners of medieval Russia included Joseph Volokolamsk Monastery, Kirilo-Belozersky Monastery and the Solovetsky Monastery. In the 18th century, the three greatest monasteries were recognized as lavras, while those subordinated directly to the synod were labeled Staropijek. In the 1540s, Metropolitan Macarius convened a number of church councils, which culminated in the 100-chapter Council of 1551. This assembly unified church ceremonies and duties in the whole territory of Russia. At the demand of the church hierarchy, the government cancelled the Tsar's jurisdiction over ecclesiastics. Autocephaly and reorganization. The growing might of the Russian state contributed also to the growing authority of the autocephalous Russian Church, and during the reign of Tsar Fyodor I, his brother-in-law Boris Godunov contacted the ecumenical patriarch who was much embarrassed for want of funds, with a view to elevate the status of the Russian Orthodox Church to an independent autocephaly. On January 23, 1589, the Moscow Patriarchate was created, making the Russian Church autocephalous, and John, Metropolitan of Moscow, became the Patriarch of Moscow and all Rus. During the next half a century, when the Tsardom was weak, the Patriarchs would run the state along with the Tsars. 17th century. The beginning of the 17th century proved to be a hard time for Russia. The Poles and Swedes invaded Russia from the west. At this time of trouble, the Russian Church fulfilled its patriotic duty before the people with honor, as it did before. Patriarch Germogin, the leader of an insurrection against invading Poles, and later starved to death imprisoned, was the spiritual leaders of the mass levy led by Minon and Pozharsky. The defense during the siege of Trinity Street. Sergius Lavra, from a Polish-Lithuanian irregular army between 1608 and 1610, has been inscribed forever in the chronicle of the Russian state and the Russian Church. Schism of the Old Believers. The main and tragic event in the 17th century was the Great Schism, the schism of the so-called Old Believers, who seceded from the main church in protest against ecclesiastical reforms of Patriarch Nikon. In the period after the invaders were driven away from Russia, the Russian Church was engaged in one of the most important of its internal tasks, namely, introducing corrections into its service books and rites. A great contribution to this was made by Patriarch Nikon, a bright personality and outstanding church reformer. Some clergymen and lay people did not understand and did not accept the liturgical reforms introduced by Patriarch Nikon and refused to obey the church authority. This was how the Old Believers schism emerged. Nikon, pursuing the ideal of a theocratic state, attempted to establish the primacy of the Orthodox Church over the state in Russia, and he also undertook a thorough revision of Russian Orthodox texts and rituals to bring them into accord with the rest of Eastern Orthodoxy. In 1652, Nikon resolved to centralize power that had been distributed locally, while conforming Russian Orthodox rites and rituals to those of the Greek Orthodox Church. For instance, he insisted that Russian Christians cross themselves with 3 fingers, rather than the then traditional 2. This aroused antipathy among a substantial section of the believers who saw the changed rites as heresy. Although they had only a minor ritual significance, this group became known as the Old Ritual Believers or Old Believers, who rejected the teachings of the new Patriarch. Tsar Alexei upheld Nikon's changes. During the so-called Raskol, the Old Ritual Believers were separated from the Orthodox Church. Avakym Petrov, Boyanya Morozova and many other dissidents were burned at the stake, either forcibly or voluntarily. Millions seceded from the official church and were strongly persecuted by the state. In order to escape persecution, they migrated to more remote areas of the realm and even abroad. Many went to Siberia and other inhospitable lands, where they would live in semi-seclusion until the modern times. The schism peaked in 1666 when Nikon was deposed, but the Russian Church retained his reforms and anathematized those who continued to oppose them. The Old Believers had formed a vigorous body of dissenters within the Russian Orthodox Church for the next 2 centuries. Expansion. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Russian Orthodox Church experienced phenomenal geographic expansion. In 1684, Moscow Patriarchate requested Constantinople that the metropolia of Kiev be made subordinate to Moscow, but the request was declined. Eventually, in 1686, after Patriarch Parthenius IV was succeeded by Dionysius IV, it was agreed to subordinate the metropolia of Kiev to Moscow. But just a year later, in 1687, such subordination was denounced by the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, and those in charge were defrocked because of the bribe. In any case, this brought millions of faithful and a half-dozen dioceses under the pastoral and administrative care of the Russian Orthodox Patriarch. Leaders learned local languages and translated the Gospels and the hymns. Sometimes those translations required the invention of new systems of transcription. However, the success was superficial and quickly reversed. Empress Catherine the Great issued an Edict of Religious Freedom in 1773, which allowed other religious organizations to operate in the empire. The edict marked the end of significant missionary activity, and saw the rise of apostasy among the new Christian communities. In particular, areas that had previously been under Islamic influence reverted to Islam. Stephen Neal argues that the figures of apostasy ... are so overwhelming as to amount to a grave condemnation of the whole Russian method of evangelism, through government pressure and favor, without the kind of Christian teaching that could make conversion anything more than nominal. In the 19th century, there were small-scale missionary efforts in Russian possessions in Asia and Alaska, as well as in Japan and China. The Japanese mission was the most successful, reaching about 35,000 baptized members in 1914. Reform and the Holy Synod. In 1700, following the death of Patriarch Adrian, Peter I prevented a successor from being named. In 1721, following the advice of Ferovan Prokopovich, the Patriarchate of Moscow was replaced with the Most Holy Governing Synod to govern the Church instead of a dating permit. The Holy Governing Synod was modeled after the state-controlled synods of the Lutheran Church of Sweden and in Prussia, and was tightly intertwined with the state. The chief procurator of the synod, a lay official who obtained ministerial rank in the first half of the 19th century, henceforth exercised effective control over the Church's administration until 1917. This control, which was facilitated by the political subservience of most of the higher clergy, was especially marked during the procuratorship of the arch-conservative Konstantin Pobedonosiev. The synod remained the supreme church body in the Russian Church for almost 2 centuries. In the synodal period of its history from 1721 to 1917, the Russian Church paid a special attention to the development of religious education and mission in provinces. Old churches were restored and new churches were built. The beginning of the 19th century was marked by the work of brilliant theologians. Russian theologians also did much to develop such sciences as history, linguistics and Oriental studies. In 1762, Peter III secularized all church land and serfs, henceforth state property. Catherine the Great promised to return the land if the church supported her coup. She reneged on the promise, paying stipends with just 1/4 of the value of the seized land. She closed 569 out of 954 monasteries, and only 161 got government money. Only 400,000 rubles of church wealth was paid back. In 1785, the Orthodox clergy did not receive a single seat in Catherine's legislative commission. By 1786, Catherine chose to simply exclude all religion and clerical studies programs from lay education. In 1797, the Holy Synod banned the election of priests who were now appointed by bishops. The 18th century saw the rise of Starchestvo and Apicius Velichkovsky and his disciples at the Optina monastery. This marked the beginning of a significant spiritual revival in the Russian Church after a lengthy period of modernization. Fundamental religious renaissance. During the final decades of the imperial order in Russia, many educated Russians sought to return to the church and revitalize the faith. No less evident were nonconformist paths of spiritual searching known as God-seeking. Writers, artists, and intellectuals in large numbers were drawn to private prayer, mysticism, spiritualism, theosophy, and Eastern religions. A fascination with elemental feeling, with the unconscious and the mythic, proliferated along with visions of coming catastrophe and redemption. The visible forms of God-seeking were extensive. A series of religious philosophical meetings were held in St. Petersburg in 1901 to 1903, bringing together prominent intellectuals and clergy to explore together ways to reconcile the church with the growing if undogmatic desire among the educated for spiritual meaning in life. Especially after 1905, various religious societies arose, though much of this religious upheaval was informal. Circles and salons, seances, private prayer. Some clergy also sought to revitalize Orthodox faith, most famously the charismatic Father John of Kronstadt, who, until his death in 1908, emphasized Christian living and sought to restore fervency and the presence of the miraculous in liturgical celebration. In 1909, a sensation-creating volume of essays appeared under the title Veki, authored by a group of leading left-wing intellectuals, mostly former Marxists, who bluntly repudiated the materialism and atheism that had dominated the thought of the intelligentsia for generations as leading inevitably to failure and moral disaster. One sees a similarly renewed vigor and variety in religious life and spirituality among the lower classes, especially after the upheavals of 1905. Among the peasantry we see widespread interest in spiritual ethical literature and non-conformist, moral spiritual movements, an upsurge in pilgrimage and other devotions to sacred spaces and objects, persistent beliefs in the presence and power of the supernatural, the renewed vitality of local ecclesial communities actively shaping their own ritual and spiritual lives, sometimes in the absence of clergy, and defining their own sacred places and forms of piety, and the proliferation of what the Orthodox establishment branded as sectarianism, including both non-Orthodox Christian denominations, notably Baptists, and various forms of deviant popular orthodoxy and mysticism. Russian Revolution. In 1914 in Russia, there were 55,173 Russian Orthodox churches and 29,593 chapels, 112,629 priests and deacons, 550 monasteries and 475 convents, with a total of 95,259 monks and nuns. The year 1917 was a major turning point for the history of Russia, and also the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Empire was dissolved and a Tsarist government, which had granted the Church numerous privileges, was overthrown. After a few months of political turmoil, the Bolsheviks took power in October 1917 and declared a separation of church and state. The government seized all church lands. Thus, the Russian Orthodox Church found itself without official state backing for the first time in its history. One of the first decrees of the new communist government declared freedom of religious and anti-religious propaganda. This led to a marked decline in the power and influence of the Church. The Church was also caught in the crossfire of the Russian Civil War that began later the same year, and many leaders of the Church supported what would ultimately turn out to be the losing side. The Russian Orthodox Church supported the White Army in the Russian Civil War after the October Revolution. This may have further strengthened the Bolshevik animus against the Church. According to Lenin, a communist regime cannot remain neutral on the question of religion but must show itself to be merciless towards it. There was no place for the Church in Lenin's classless society. Even before the end of the Civil War and the establishment of the Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church came under persecution of the communist government. The Soviet government stood on a platform of militant atheism, viewing the Church as a counter-revolutionary organization and an independent voice with a great influence in society. While the Soviet Union officially claimed religious toleration, in practice the government discouraged organized religion and did everything possible to remove religious influence from Soviet society. The Russian Orthodox Church supported Tsarist Russia, therefore creating another reason the Bolsheviks would attempt to diminish their influence on the Russian people and government.